Last time we left off after finally removing the motor. In this part, we'll get the motor on a stand and strip everything off it. First, we drain the transmission fluid by using a 24mm socket. I'd recommend doing this while the motor and transmission are still in the car. Now to remove the passenger side axle, we remove these two 14mm bolts. By removing the three 14mm bolts on the axle mount, we can free up the passenger side axle. Next is the driver's side axle. I used a pry bar and mallet to hit it as horizontally as I could. A trick some people like to do is use an old clutch fork to fit around the axle housing. We removed the three 14mm bolts to separate the rear subframe motor mount from the transmission.
Yeah, net loss of 500. Does that mean you've spent no money on Christmas?
Yep.
Wow.
And then I'm
With the motor mount removed, we can remove the whole rear suspension subassembly.
There you go. That's good.
Now we can start unbolting the transmission by removing the two 17mm bolts at the top, and the rest are four 14mm bolts.
I can give you that last
Luckily I had handsome Simon helping out again to hold the motor steady since I didn't have a cherry picker.
That sounds good.
I'm gonna be pissed, which it feels like he kind of did. Alright, ready?
Yeah.
See, that one felt like it was like torque to like what I would expect for aluminum.
What's gone into me?
For not wearing long. It's that new professional job of yours.
Oh
You know what I should have done, what I'm gonna do.
Before freeing up the transmission, make sure to disconnect the speed sensor.
Did you do it?
Yeah.
You are so smart. Well, that's steel toe, so the steel toe is gonna bend and keep my toe stuck in there. You know?
So you never take them off, so you're always safe.
Yep.
I used the jack to support the weight of the transmission while it was being removed.
Whoa, wait.
You good?
Yeah.
Are they separated?
Yeah. I think you could probably tell.
Oh wait, there's still a connection. Oh no, it's stupid wiring harness.
I told you. Hey, we're free. Wow. You strung there or something?
The clutch pressure plate is held on by six 12mm bolts.
I don't even feel it, buddy.
While being loosened, the crank pulley on the other side of the motor needs to be held with a socket to keep it from rotating.
I think they're all loose now. Ow.
Now for the flywheel, there are 8 14mm 12-point bolts that we have to remove.
I like to work smart. I use my weight. You like to pull up.
With those 8 bolts removed, the flywheel should just come off. Unfortunately, I'm an idiot and forgot to hit record during the removal. Now we can jack up the motor as high as we can on the motorcycle jack, and use the transmission mounting holes for the stand's motor mount.
No.
Figure to start.
Yeah, that's a nice long rod right there. And trust me, I know long rods. You have to go clean the bathroom or something?
Yeah, you do this. I'm gonna go scrub a toilet.
We don't have a cherry picker to use, so we have to pick up the motor and mount it ourselves. Luckily I have a beefcake like Simon to help out since he actually did a majority of the heavy lifting.
Holy ass, that's heavy.
Lift your end and push towards me. Can you lift your end? Alright, readjust. Can you hold it for a second?
Oh my god, you are.
We're good.
Alright.
You're good, you're good.
Holy. Is it on?
Yeah.
Hold on. Is it in enough?
Yeah. Yeah, we're in a good amount.
There's gonna be some bodybuilders coming. Maybe a couple big lugs.
You did like 85% of the lifting, I'm pretty sure. Because my side started resting on it and you were just stuck with it going down.
Now that the motor is on the stand, we can start stripping everything off of it. First we want to disconnect the 2 connections to the alternator, one of them being held on by a 10mm nut. Now we remove the crank position sensor by removing the 10mm bolt. Next is disconnecting the oil pressure switch. Next is the starter. The starter is held on by 2 of the transmission bolts which have already been removed, so now we only need to disconnect the 2 connections, with one being held on by a 12mm nut. Next we disconnect the knock sensor that's located underneath the intake manifold. Now we unplug the oil control valve and the 4 injectors. Moving to the other side of the engine, we need to disconnect the idle air control from the throttle body, EVAP sensors from the vacuum lines, throttle position sensor, oil control valve, oil pressure switch, and a ground wire held by a 10mm bolt. Going back to the top of the motor, we can disconnect all the coil packs. Before finally removing the harness, I realized I forgot to disconnect the coolant temperature sensor. Now we should be able to free up the entire wiring harness, just make sure to not pull too hard in case the wiring harness gets stuck. Seeing how complex the wiring harness actually is, it shows how important labeling each connection is. Now we remove the 2 12mm bolts holding the fuel rail to the engine block. To start removing the hoses, we remove the EVAP hose attached to the throttle body, the hose connecting the valve cover to the intake manifold, and the hose connecting the valve cover to the throttle body. Now we go back to the side of the engine and remove the two coolant hoses attaching the engine block and the throttle body. For removing the intake manifold, there are 4 12mm bolts and one 12mm nut that needs to be removed. Mine was missing a bolt, so we only need to remove 3. At the bottom of the intake manifold, there's one 14mm bolt that we need to remove. Next, we need to remove the alternator, held in by one 12mm bolt up top and one 14mm bolt at the bottom. Now we remove the pulley tensioner and the tensioner arm by removing two 13mm bolts and one 17mm bolt. Next, we remove the water pump pulley by removing 4 10mm bolts. I used an Allen wrench to keep the pulley itself from spinning. With the pulley out of the way, we can get to the water pump, which is held in by 6 10mm bolts. Not all of the bolts are the same length, so make sure to keep track of where each bolt was. The housing for the water pump will also still have coolant in it, so make sure to lay something down underneath the engine stand. Now we can remove the crankcase breather hose by removing two 10mm bolts holding it in. Now we remove the oil dipstick and the ground wire on the valve cover held in by a 14mm bolt. The coolant piping has two brackets, one held by a 10mm bolt and the other held by a 12mm. So that's it for part 5. We were able to strip everything off the motor, so next time we'll get started disassembling the engine and inspecting the condition. Thanks again for watching, and take care.